Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe and the Birth of the Russian Empire, Episode 118, Moscow versus Kazan. We saw previously that Vytautas needed to secure his northern and western borders before he could concentrate on any plans to expand to the south and east. Ivan III took the throne in the opposite position. He needed to secure his southern and eastern borders against the Tatars before he could pursue his ambition to gather the Rus. Other than the campaign with Tokhtamysh that had ended in disaster on the Vorskla, events had meant that Vytautas was never able to fully commit to the east. As we heard last time, Knyazhestva that had allied with him ended up reverting back to Moscow's influence when Lithuania left them stranded. Ivan will be more successful in his endeavours. His two biggest problems were Kazan and Novgorod. Of these, Kazan was clearly the biggest. It blocked Russian control of the Volga and turned the forest-steppe belt into contested territory. Against a united Russia, Kazan would have been clearly weaker. But against Moscow alone, it was more of an even match. In the early days of the Khanate, it had badly defeated Vasily II at Suzdal, but Ivan seems to have felt that he was in a good position at the start of his reign. He had Qasim on his side, who proved to be a loyal long-term ally and potentially even a Moscow-backed candidate for Khan, and in the last year of his father's reign, the Khan had been making repeated peace overtures. The first thing that the chronicles record Ivan III doing after he took the throne was sending a force into the north of the Khanate, usually interpreted as a reconnaissance mission. Two generals, Boris Kozhanov and Boris Slipoy, the Blind, gathered a force from Vologda, Galich and Ustyug and set off south from Ustyug. They went south along the rivers Yug and Malozha to Kotelnich, and then along the Vyatka to where it joined the Kama, and the Kama runs down to Kazan. This became the preferred route for Ivan's Kazan expeditions. The chronicle does not record the outcome of this first mission, but it does record the Tatars retaliating with a raid on Ustyug. The men of Ustyug pursued the raiders back to the south, caught up with them, and released the Russians that had been taken prisoner. After this rather inauspicious beginning, Ivan was content to bide his time for the next 5 years, and wait for a proper opportunity to do something. That opportunity came in 1467. When Khan Mahmutek died, he had been succeeded by his third son, Ibrahim, younger brother of Qasim. At some point, Ivan becomes convinced that Kazan is racked by dissension between competing factions and dissatisfaction with the Khan. One of these factions eventually approaches Qasim and invites him to come and take his rightful place on the throne. So, in 1467, Ivan agrees to provide Qasim with a large army and 3 of his prominent generals. There's some confusion in the sources around the early Kazan Khanate. Some suggest that Ulu Muhammad was the founder, which is often rejected by scholars on the basis that he had held and apparently wished to return to Sarai. The alternative and more favoured suggestion is that it was his son Mahmutek who founded the Khanate. The History of Kazan, a Russian text written later, claims that Mahmutek killed his father and his younger brother Yakub and then set himself up as Khan. There's only one other source that mentions such murders, and the History of Kazan has a tendency to present popular tales as fact. The idea of a son who has killed his father to take the throne is often also linked to the idea of an unjust ruler, which the Russian writer of the history supports as part of his intent is to undermine the legitimacy of the Khans. However, some scholars have taken the story at face value and used it to explain these events. The idea of Tatars killing each other over the succession seems anachronistic by this point in their development, but not totally unimaginable, and it provides a basis for both the Kazan nobility reaching out to Qasim and Qasim being ready to join Ivan against his brother. However, the expedition was a complete failure. The chroniclers take the position that it was in fact a perfidious Tatar scheme to lure the Muscovites into a trap with lies about support for Qasim. The army set out in mid-September, marching overland to reach the Volga near Kazan, where it found Khan Ibrahim waiting for it. To be fair, we do not have sufficient evidence to tell whether it was all a ruse or whether the Khan had simply figured out the plot against him. In any case, Qasim had lost the element of surprise. His men, tired from their march, found themselves facing Tatars who had already taken up the best position on the field, and they decided to abandon the whole thing and return home. Once again, the Tatars followed up on the Russian incursion with a punitive raid, this time against Galij. Ivan responded by building new fortifications and increasing the size of town garrisons in regions bordering on Kazan. Although this campaign had failed, the idea was clearly well planted. 3 months later, a new army was gathered in Galij under the command of Knyaz Simeon Yaroslavsky and set off south towards Kazan. This time, they managed to keep their progress a secret. They reached Kazan in January and pillaged the surrounding area before withdrawing. A separate mission from Nizhny Novgorod also successfully advanced along the Volga. This more positive experience encouraged Ivan, and he decided that it was time for a major operation. He moved to Vladimir, taking his brothers, Yuri and Boris, and his cousin, Knyaz Vasily of Verea, and left his 2 other brothers to defend Moscow. To preserve secrecy, when an ambassador from Lithuania came to see him, Ivan travelled to Pereyaslavl and received him there. Then, for reasons that are not explained in the chronicles, Ivan changed his mind and delayed the campaign. In the late spring, the Tatars raided Kichmenga, and Ivan ordered a commander named Ivan Dmitrievich Runo to take an army south along the Vyatka and Kama. The beginning did not go well. The men taken to join the army had left the town of Vyatka short of defenders, and while Runo gathered his army, the Tartars were raiding Vyatka behind his back. The town was forced to surrender to Ibrahim. Meanwhile, the army continued along the Vyatka into Tatar territory, laying the countryside to waste as they went. At a tributary of the Kama called the Bielaya, they ran into 200 Tatar raiders traveling by boat. After a short chase, the Russians killed them all. Then they went home. At the same time, Ivan had again sent a separate force from Nizhny Novgorod, which had also had a successful encounter with the Tatars and even captured the noble in charge. By the beginning of 1469, Ivan was ready for his full-scale campaign. He had run successful reconnaissance missions along both his routes, and he was confident that his commanders knew what they were doing. The armies began to assemble in the spring. The first was to be the biggest, travelling by river from Nizhny Novgorod and commanded by a boyar named Konstantin Bezubov. All Ivan's towns were required to send men, who were joined by further contingents from his brothers. Knyaz Pyotr Obolensky-Nagoy brought the men of Moscow. The Second Army was commanded by Knyaz Daniil Yaroslavsky and comprised contingents from Vologda, Galich, and Ustyug. It sailed from Ustyug to Vyatka, where Yaroslavsky ordered the men of the city to assemble and join the expedition. However, here they hit an obstacle. The men of Vyatka refused. They claimed that their submission to Ibrahim the previous year had placed them under an oath of neutrality, and they also thought that Yaroslavsky's army was too small. The last thing they wanted was to go and provoke the Tatars into another attack. To make things worse, the Khan had an ambassador in the town, and he immediately sent word to Kazan that an army was about to set off south along the Vyatka, ruining any chance that they had of a surprise attack. With fewer troops than he needed, and knowing the Tatars would be ready and waiting, Yaroslavsky abandoned his mission. When he received word that the diversionary attack from the north would not be coming, Ivan sent word to Bezubov to reduce the attack from Nizhny Novgorod to a volunteer pillaging force. The men were ordered not to approach Kazan itself. The chroniclers and historians agree that their reports are reliable, say that the entire army volunteered. Bezubov stayed in Nizhny Novgorod to await his next task, and the army elected Runo as leader based on his previous experience. Runo immediately decided to ignore the instructions not to attack Kazan. The army sailed down the Volga, travelling by night and arriving at Kazan as the day broke on 22nd of May. The city was caught completely off guard as it was awakened by the sound of trumpets and the Russians attacking the outer settlements. The Russians released what the chronicle calls all the Christian prisoners from Moscow, Ryazan, Lithuania, Vyatka, Ustyug, Perm, and other towns, and set fires before withdrawing back up the river to rest on an island. Runo's scouts brought word that Ibrahim was gathering a large army, so he split his forces in two. A smaller force was sent ahead, where it got ambushed by the Tatar cavalry, but managed to fight its way out and reach the designated rendezvous at an island called Irichov. The main force encountered Ibrahim's men, and there was a long and hard-fought battle. During the day, Bezubsov arrived with a relief force, and they drove the Tatars back into Kazan. Although Runeau had gone against his orders, Ivan was impressed with his success and wanted to continue the campaign. Messengers were sent to the Northern Army and Vyatka, telling them to march. Once again, the men of Vyatka claimed that they could not breach their treaty with Kazan, and in any case, the army was too small to be sure of success. The chronicle claims that they said they would only join the campaign if Ivan's own brothers came to lead them. After 7 weeks waiting on Irichov, Bezubsov had received no news of the Northern Army. His supplies were running short, and he was forced to withdraw. As they set sail back to Nizhny Novgorod, they met the previous Khan's widow. She had been living with Kasim and was now sailing to Kazan to visit Ibrahim. To Bezubsov's surprise, she informed him that Ivan had told her there would be no more enmity between the Grand Knyaz and the Khan. Apparently, the campaign had been cancelled again. As it turned out, this time the Northern Army had actually marched. But when it reached the Kama, it was blocked by a force of Tatars in boats, resulting in a major battle in which the commander, Knyaz Yaroslavsky, was killed. But the main Russian force had managed to withdraw intact. The Khan's widow was wrong about the end of enmity. At the end of the summer of 1469, Ivan assembled another expeditionary force. Judging by the listing of contributing towns and commanders in the chronicle, it was the largest yet. Ivan's brothers Yuri and Andrei the Elder, along with Knyaz Vasily of Verea, were in command. They arrived at Kazan on 1st of September and established the siege. This time, everything went as smoothly as anyone could want. The Russians managed to cut the town's water supply, so Ibrahim was forced to sue for peace in less than a week. According to the chronicle, he bowed in submission to all Knyaz Yuri's conditions and released all the prisoners taken by the Tatars since the Khanate was founded. Unfortunately, the chroniclers did not think the conditions needed to be recorded. What is clear, though, is that it was a good truce. While any serious ideas about putting Kasim on the throne had been a failure, Ivan had done enough to make the Khan turn cautious. The peace will hold for 9 years, in which Ivan will be able to turn his attention to the west. The whole episode is characteristic of how Ivan worked. He found a pretext for action, but then went slowly. He did not overcommit. He did not even really commit until he was reasonably sure that he had a good chance. He gave command of his armies to trusted generals, knyazes and boyars in the early stages, his brothers when the campaign got serious. Later, one of Ivan's Polish opponents will say disparagingly that Ivan fought from his bed. We're moving away from the medieval ages idea of kings as battle leaders. It's a good thing that Ivan has generals that he can trust. but it's also clear from the sources that he was very much in charge of planning and strategy. As far as the Kazan Khanate goes, while Ivan may have been misled as to how much support there was for a Qasim takeover, it does indeed develop factions, and a long-running debate over whether it should be aligned with Moscow or the rest of the post-Mongol world. Tatar historian Bulat Hamidulin writes, quote, "The history of the Kazan Khanate resembles a constant wavering between two political extremes, from a union with Christian Russia to searching for connection with Muslim states, the Siberian Khanate, the Nogai Horde, later Crimea and Turkey." End quote. The Moscow faction was driven by trade and economic interests. Russia was, after all, the Khanate's biggest and nearest neighbour. Some historians have claimed that it best represented the interests of the population. However, for the majority of the Kazan elite, closer ties with Russia were always prevented by Russia demanding their submission and dependency. The religious issue was also real. We should remember that at this point in time, no European Christian state had ruled over a Muslim population. The theoretical framework that would allow them to do so still needed to be worked out. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.